Now in this section, let's continue onward with our BGP configuration exercise. So the high-level process is that we're configuring BGP peering, in this case external BGP between an Arista router and a Cisco router. So in our example, Arista switch 5 and PyNet router 1. Or yeah, PyNet router 1. So up to this point, we just have figured out what our configuration needs to be. We've basically made static Jinja 2 templates, and we've verified that we can cause those templates to get rendered into configs. But in this case, the rendering isn't doing anything besides copying the file because we have no Jinja 2 variables, nor do we have any Jinja 2 flow control in our template. So what we want to start doing is converting this over to variable representation. So if I go into my host vars directory, I previously made this PyNet switch 5, and we start making some variables that are going to represent things in our Jinja 2 template. So I'm going to just copy our template, and now let's start looking at things that we're going to convert into variables. So we'll say BGP AS, so our autonomous system. We're going to make that into a variable. Now we have representations here for the BGP peer and for the network we're going to announce and for the static route in this case that we're going to add. Now for both of these, for both the BGP peer and for the routes we're going to announce, we're going to want to make these into a data structure that could have more than one element. Because obviously we could have more than one BGP peer and we could have more than one network we want to announce. So as opposed to having a single element, I want to have a list-like structure that could have more than one element. So here we'll say something like BGP peers or BGP neighbors. We're going to have a list structure, and then we'll have things like peer IP is this, peer AS is this, maximum routes. Maximum routes we could have or not have depending on whether that was going to change, but here we'll hard code that, or here we'll specify that as a variable. So there's our BGP peers. We'll make another variable for the routes we're going to announce. Once again, we're going to want to have the capability of announcing more than one route. So here I'll say the prefix is 2.2.2.0. The mask is 24. Now, we could potentially have the mask just hard-coded up here and not have this separate mask variable. You could go either way on that. And then let's make something for the static routes that we're going to add. Now, since this data is actually the same, you could potentially have coupled these together, the announced routes and the static routes. I didn't particularly want to do this because here these static routes, you could easily see static routes that wouldn't get announced, and you could also easily see announced routes that weren't static. So I did not want to couple those together. So I decoupled those and made two separate data structures. There's other ways you could accomplish this, like you could have a field in here that had something like announce equals true. If the announce was equal true, then it would go up and add it here so that you wouldn't have to duplicate this data. Okay, so there's our variables. Go ahead and delete that template representation. I'm just going to copy this so I remember my variable names. Go into here. Now, let's go ahead and convert these to data structures and add flow control. So this is going to be BGP AS. This is going to be... Now here, since we have a list-like structure, we're actually going to want to loop over it. So we'll do for peer in BGP peers. We'll go into here, and this will be the peer IP. This will be, whoops, it's not peer IP because it's a dictionary. It's peer, which is our looping variable, which gives me back this data structure here, and then it's .peer IP. Similarly over here, it is peer.peer AS, and then this is going to be this same thing here, and then this is going to be peer.maximum routes. Okay, so that handles that section of the template. Now let's move on to our announced routes. Once again, we're going to have a for loop. Going to loop over that. It's not going to be in BGP peers. It's going to be in announced routes. Get rid of that. Okay. We'll call it the loop variable. We'll call route. So then we have route.prefix. And then notice we don't have any slash here, so we have to add our slash, and then we add route.mask, and then we end our for loop. And then we're going to have a very similar for loop here for route in static routes. I'm intentionally going to change this to not be the same variable there so that this variable won't have previously existed in the template. So I'll call this static route. Okay, so now this is going to be static route dot prefix, and then static route dot mask, and then static route dot next hop. So we have that. We should have the peers. We should have the announced routes, prefix, mask, and next hop. I think we have that. We need to end our for loop. Section should look like that. And then I'll just add an exclamation point before and after the two sections in case we are gluing these together with other config items that came from other templates. Now let's go ahead and execute our playbook. See what happens when we try to regenerate this Arista config. So it's testing napalm connectivity. We didn't really need that, but let's look at this switch 5. Okay, so generating our config, we have our peers. we have the maximum routes, we have the network we're being announced, we have the null route that we're creating. So that looks right. Now let's repeat this process for PyNet router 1. So we'll go into host vars, we'll go into, we'll make the directory, PyNet router 1, we'll cd into that directory, we will copy what we have in the Arista directory, copy that into here. Now we'll go ahead and cat this so we have the structure of that. Temporarily, I will just copy that into here so we know exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so BGP AS 42, BGP peer. So BGP peer is going to be 32. The remote AS is 18. This I'm going to make a null string, so we don't need any maximum routes there. Announced prefixes, we are going to announce 1.1.50.0. We're going to announce 255.255.0 for the mask. We go to our static routes. Copy this. Okay. Our next hop is in fact null 0. So there's the 50 route. Copy that. There's the 51 route. Copy that. Okay, so we have those. Think we have everything. Go ahead and delete these lines. Go to the top. Copy this, just so we have all the variable names for reference. Then go and update our Jinja 2 template. So once again, we're just converting all this over so that it's represented in the form of variables, and we have the flow control that we need for across time. In this case, we're accommodating the fact that we want to ultimately be able to handle more than one peer, and we ultimately want to be able to handle more than one route being announced. Okay, so this is going to go to BGP AS. Here we're going to have our for loop, so I'm going to copy some of the for loop constructs from here, because this pattern should be very similar. Now I got to make things a little bit clear here, because I'm going to have quite a bit of clutter. I'll put that in. Okay, so I need this. This actually is lower in the Cisco, so that goes there. That's my BGP peers for loop. Here is my network announcement for loop. And then I'm going to have a static route for loop like this. Now I need to update these things to be variables. So this, I don't need 2 entries of this, just 1. This is going to be route dot prefix. And route dot mask. This is going to be peer.peerIP. This is going to be peer.remote AS. Peer AS, excuse me. So peer.peer AS. Then we get down here, we have static routes. So we don't need two because we have a for loop where they'll each get generated. So this is going to be static route dot prefix, static route dot mask, static route dot next hop. Okay, so delete all this, delete the rest of those lines, add an exclamation point at the end, add an exclamation point at the beginning just for our dividers. Go ahead and rerun our playbook. Go ahead and add our tags. So we only are doing the template generation. Go ahead and look at our configs. So we had an old swap file. See if I still have that file open. Okay. So look at this. AS looks right. The two networks we're announcing looks right. Our peer looks right with its remote AS, and our two static routes look correct. Okay, so we've now converted this over from being just a static hard-coded template where we split variables into our inventory system. So really you want to start decoupling the things that change and moving them into your inventory system or into your variable system more generally, and then putting the things that are not going to change either in your templates and your playbooks. And we also had a few situations where we had to think ahead a little bit and say, oh, well, I know that in many situations I'm going to have more than one of these things. So inherently I want a for loop here so that I can easily accommodate growth in my number of BGP peers and my number of announced routes in the number of these null routes that I'm creating. Okay, so now we've completed that. In the next section, we're going to start expanding on this with pushing our configs actually out to the devices. Start thinking about, ultimately we'll start thinking about the validation. How do we do the validation? And I'll also probably experiment a little bit once we get everything variabilized. Well, what if we set up some more changes to this? Like, what if we announced new routes? What if I wanted the Arista switch to also try to peer with the iOS XR? Things like that. So now that we have everything variabilized, we could start thinking about, basically that it's pretty easy to expand on the framework that we have and see if that all works properly.